One small choice can act as a catalyst, starting a chain reaction that changes the course of a lifetime forever. Witness the explosive power of a single moment in our newest collection of intense, high-stakes cinematic narratives. Hit subscribe now and be there for the moment everything changes. My son sent me a text message 4 days before his company's grand opening celebration. 11 words, Dad. This event is professionals only. We'll call you after. I'm Walter Harding, 63 years old, retired, civil engineer, and the man who quietly funded every single thing my son has built over the last 9 years. One text message. No phone call. No explanation beyond those 11 words that told me everything I needed to know about how far things had drifted between us and me. My son decided his self-made entrepreneur father was too rough around the edges for the investors and media contacts he'd spent 2 years courting. Old Toronto establishment money versus a guy who spent 30 years in muddy work boots on construction sites. They wanted polish. I represented the past he was trying to escape. Here's what my son forgot when he hit send on that message. When you spend 3 decades building infrastructure across Ontario, you don't just build roads and bridges. You build relationships. You become part of a network where every contract, every permit, every handshake matters. And sometimes that network includes the very people your son just invited to celebrate a business you quietly bankrolled from the beginning. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened. I didn't do what I did out of spite. I did it because I finally understood something my own father told me the day I started my first job out of Queen's University. He said, "Son, the moment you let someone treat you like furniture, you've taught them that's all you are." I spent 63 years learning that lesson. I wasn't about to unlearn it for 11 words, sent without so much as a phone call. Let me show you exactly what 9 years of being a silent investor looks like. When my son, Daniel, and his business partner launched their first concept back in 2015. They had a pitch deck, a rented office in Kitchener, and about 4 months of runway. Daniel called me from a parking lot, voice tight with stress. "Dad, we're close to something real here. We just need a bridge." I asked how much. He said, $80,000. I transferred it that afternoon without a single condition attached, because I believed in him, and because that's what fathers do. That was the first transfer. It was not the last. Over the following years, I kept a spreadsheet. Not because I'm a suspicious man, but because I spent 30 years managing project budgets and tracking numbers, is simply how I think. Seed funding for the Kitchener office, $80,000. Equipment loan, when the first contract fell through, $35,000. Legal fees during the partnership dispute in 2019, $22,000. The down payment assistance when Daniel and his wife, Simone, bought their house in Oakville, $60,000. Operating bridge when a major client delayed payment for 4 months, $45,000. Smaller amounts in between for travel. Conferences. Software licenses. The kind of expenses that don't feel significant in the moment but accumulate quietly like snowfall. Total. As of last January, $412,000. I have every transfer record. What I didn't record was the gradual shift in how my son spoke to me. "Thanks." Dad evolved into, "I'll pay you back when we scale," which eventually became just a summary of what had already been decided. The conversations changed too. Early on, he'd call to think things through, to get my read on a situation. Somewhere around year 5, that stopped. I'd hear about major decisions after they were made. New contracts. New hires. New office space. I was informed, not consulted. I noticed it clearly at a family dinner last Christmas. Daniel spent most of the evening on his phone. And when I mentioned a concern I had about the company's expansion pace, he looked at me with that particular patience people reserve for someone they've decided doesn't quite understand. Dad, the landscape has changed. This isn't civil engineering. I smiled and let it go, because that's what I'd always done. The real shift happened when Daniel's business partner, a man named Craig, brought in a group of outside investors earlier this year. Suddenly there were people around my son who wore expensive watches and talked about optics and brand positioning. I met them once, briefly, at a dinner Daniel hosted. One of them, a man from an old Rosedale family whose grandfather had made the money, and whose father had multiplied it, shook my hand and then spent the rest of the evening not quite looking at me. I wasn't rude. I wasn't loud. I asked reasonable questions about their growth strategy. On the drive home, Daniel was quiet. I asked if something was wrong. He said, "Dad, these people have a certain way. They do things. It's not personal." That sentence stayed with me for weeks. 3 weeks before the grand opening, Daniel called to discuss the event. He was excited, describing the venue, the guest list, the media contacts who'd confirmed. I asked if he needed anything from me. He said, "Actually, Dad, we were hoping you could handle the insurance rider for the venue. Our events coordinator flagged it." I said I'd look into it. I found a policy, arranged the paperwork, paid the premium, $1,400. I didn't mention it again. Then came the text, "Dad, this event is professionals only. We'll call you after." I read it sitting at my kitchen table in Hamilton with my morning coffee going cold. I read it 3 times. Professionals only. I had spent 30 years as a licensed professional engineer. I had managed projects worth tens of millions of dollars. I had employed hundreds of people. I had funded a significant portion of the business that was now apparently too professional for me to attend. I called my son. Voicemail. I texted back, "We should talk before the event." His reply came 2 hours later. "Dad, I know you're probably upset, but this is a business decision, not personal. I promise we'll do a family dinner after." A family dinner after. A consolation dinner in place of the opening night of a company I had quietly sustained for nearly a decade. My retired colleague and closest friend, a man named Roy, stopped by that afternoon and found me sitting in my workshop, not actually working on anything. Roy spent 35 years as a project manager for the city of Hamilton. He is the kind of man who can read a room without being told what's in it. He looked at me, looked at the untouched workbench, and sat down on the stool by the door. I showed him the text. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What's your position here?" Walt meaning legally, financially, structurally. What do you actually control? I told him I'd been a silent supporter with no formal agreements. Just transfers. Roy shook his head slowly, not judging me, just taking stock. He said, "So you're a patron, not a partner?" I said that was about right. He said, "And the venue for this event, do you know anything about it?" I did. As it happened, the venue Daniel had chosen for the grand opening was a restored heritage building in downtown Hamilton called the Barton Room. I knew it well. I knew it because 18 months earlier the owners had reached out to me through a mutual contact in the construction industry. They were undertaking a significant renovation and needed an engineer to review the structural assessment before the city would approve the occupancy permit. I had done that review. I had written the report that allowed them to open. The owner, a woman named Patricia, had sent me a bottle of scotch and a handwritten note. We'd had lunch twice since then. I knew her well enough to call, without it being strange. Roy watched me think through this. He said, "I'm not telling you what to do, but I'd want to understand the full landscape before I made any decisions." That night I made a list, not of grievances, a list of the actual structural reality of my son's business, and this event, the venue, Patricia, who owed me a professional favor, and more importantly, trusted my judgment. The catering company, I recognized the name from a city infrastructure gala I'd organized 3 years ago. Their sales director had been trying to get a meeting with my former firm's events coordinator ever since, and I still had that contact. The audio-visual company, their lead technician, was the younger brother of a man I'd mentored through his engineering certification. I wasn't the irrelevant retired father. My son had texted into the cheap seats. I was, quietly, woven into the fabric of the city his business operated in. I called my son again the following morning. This time he answered, voice careful and slightly rushed. Dad, look, I know this is awkward. I said, I'm not calling about awkward. Danielle, I'm calling because I want to understand something clearly. Am I excluded from the opening of the company I've funded for 9 years? He exhaled. Dad, it's not exclusion. It's optics. Craig's investors have certain expectations about the narrative. We're positioning this as a bootstrap success story. I said, I see. And the $400,000. He said, Dad, please don't make this about money. I said, I'm not making it about money. I'm making it about whether I'm welcome at my own son's opening night. He said, you'll embarrass me in front of these people. The words came out before he could stop them. The line went quiet. I said, I'll embarrass you. He said, Dad, that came out wrong. I mean, you'd be uncomfortable. The environment is very specific. I said, Daniel, I built half the roads in this province. I have shaken hands with premiers and managing directors and city councilors. Tell me specifically what you think I would do in a room of investors. He said, you ask too many questions. You challenge people. Craig says it makes the room feel unstable. I ask too many questions. I had spent 30 years in a profession where asking the right questions was the difference between a bridge standing and a bridge failing. My son had decided this was a liability. I said, I'm going to ask you once. Clearly. Am I invited to your grand opening? He said, Dad. I'll send you the live stream link. We're recording the whole thing professionally. I hung up. Roy was right. I needed to understand the full landscape. I spent that evening making calls. Not threatening calls. Professional calls. The kind I'd been making for 30 years. I called Patricia at the Barton Room. She was warm, as she always is. She asked if I was coming to the Harding Boys event, said she'd recognized the name on the booking. I said I'd actually been meaning to discuss that with her. I told her what had happened. Not dramatically, just the facts. Patricia was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Walter, in 20 years of running event spaces, I have never once had a situation where the person who financially backed an event was not on the guest list. I told her. I understood she was in a difficult position. She said, I'm not in a difficult position. You are. What do you need from me? I told her I wasn't sure yet. I said I'd be back to her by Thursday. I called the catering company the next morning and asked to speak with the sales director, a man named Marcus. I reminded him of how we'd met, and he was instantly friendly. I asked about the Harding event booking. He confirmed they had it. I said, Marcus, I want to ask you something in confidence. If the primary financial backer of an event was not invited to attend, would that change anything about your relationship with that booking? He said, honestly, Walter, that would be a first for us. We do our due diligence on events. That's a real concern. By Wednesday evening, I had a complete picture. Not a plan for revenge. A picture of reality. My son had built his opening night on a foundation of relationships that ran, in several cases, directly through me. He didn't know it. He'd never thought to ask because he'd stopped thinking of me as someone with a professional life that extended beyond writing checks. My former colleague's son, Jamie, was running the AV setup. I'd written a reference letter for his apprenticeship application 8 years ago. I texted him Wednesday afternoon. He called me back within the hour. said he'd heard something about my situation through the industry grapevine and felt terrible. Thursday morning, I called Daniel one final time. He answered on the second ring, voice already defensive. I said, I'm not calling to argue. I want to ask you one question and I want a straight answer. He said, okay. I said, knowing everything you know, do you want your father at your grand opening or not? He was quiet for 10 seconds. Then, Dad, Craig's investors have already been told a certain story. Having you there complicates the narrative. I said, I see. And if I decide I'm not comfortable funding an event, I'm banned from attending, he said, Dad. You're not on any of the contracts. There's nothing to fund. I said, you're right. I'm not on the contracts. But I am the reason several of your vendors agreed to work with you at their best rates. And I think you might find the next few days illuminating. He said, are you threatening me? I said, I'm being precise. You told me this event was professionals only. I'm behaving professionally. I'll speak to you after Thursday. I called Patricia. I told her I had made my decision. I said, I'm not asking you to cancel anything. I'm asking you to enforce the standard insurance requirements for the event. The ones that require the policy guarantor to be present or to formally transfer liability. She said, Walter, the policy you arranged lists you as the responsible party without your formal sign-off on the night. I'd have to pause the event until we sort out the coverage. I said, I understand that creates a complication. She said it does. I'll need to notify the booking coordinator by end of business Friday. I called Marcus. I told him I'd be withdrawing my implicit endorsement of the booking and would be formally notifying their accounts team that my future referrals would depend on how this situation was handled. Marcus said he understood and that, in any case, he'd been reviewing the booking and had a few questions about the deposit structure that might need resolution before event day. I sent Jamie a text. I said, just want you to know. You don't owe me anything here. Handle your business the way you see fit. He replied, I'm actually double booked that weekend. I just realized it this morning. I'm really sorry. By Friday afternoon, 3 of Daniel's key vendors had issues. Daniel called at 6 o'clock Friday evening. Dad, what did you do? I said. I enforced some professional standards. He said Patricia called Craig. She said there's a problem with the insurance coverage. The caterer is asking about the deposit paperwork. The AV company canceled. Dad, the event is in 5 days. I said, I know when the event is. Danielle, I've known about it since you sent me 11 words telling me I wasn't welcome. He said, this is insane. You're destroying something I built. I said I didn't build anything. I funded something that you built. And I did it because I'm your father. And I'm still your father. But I am not a check that comes without a person attached to it. He said, what do you want? I said, I want to attend my son's grand opening. He was quiet. Then Craig's people are expecting a specific narrative. I said, Daniel, I'm asking you for the last time. Do you want your father there or not? He said, I can't change the guest list now. Too many things are already set. I said, then the insurance situation and the vendor situation are going to be very difficult to resolve. He said, so you're doing this? You're actually doing this to me? I said, no. It's all. You did this 3 weeks ago when you stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a complication. I hung up Saturday morning. I contacted Patricia and told her to proceed with formally notifying the booking. She handled it professionally, with a written notice citing the insurance coverage gap and the need for resolution before the venue could confirm the event date. Craig received the notice first. He called Daniel. Daniel called me 4 times between 9 and 11 in the morning. I didn't answer. At noon, my son's wife, Simone, called. I've always liked Simone. She's straightforward in a way that Daniel sometimes isn't. She said, Walter, I need to ask you something honestly. Is there any version of this where you come to the event and everything is fine? I said, Simone. There's a very simple version of this, where I come to the event and everything is fine. She said, Craig won't like it. I said Craig didn't fund this company. I did. She was quiet. Then she said, I know, and I'm sorry. I told Daniel this was wrong when it came up. I want you to know that. I said, I know you did. Simone, thank you for saying it. She said, I'll talk to him again. 2 hours later, Daniel called. His voice was different. The defensiveness was gone, replaced with something more tired. He said, Dad, Craig says the investors will manage. They're adaptable. He said it like he was reporting something he'd been told, rather than something he believed. I said, Daniel, I don't want to come to an event where I'm tolerated. He said, I know. I said, do you actually want me there? A long pause. He said, yes. I said, then tell me that like you mean it. Not like a business decision you're managing. Another pause. Longer. Then, Dad, I want you at my opening. I'm sorry I sent that text. I said, I know you do. And I'll be there. The grand opening was on a Thursday evening in a beautifully restored room that I had, in a small but real way, helped make safe for public use. The insurance paperwork was resolved. Marcus from the catering company had sorted his deposit questions. Jamie had found a colleague to cover his supposed double booking. I wore the charcoal suit I'd bought for my niece's wedding the previous year. Craig's investors were exactly what I expected. Polished. Careful. The kind of men who weigh every word for what it signals. One of them introduced himself and asked what I did. I told him I was a retired civil engineer and that I'd spent the last 9 years investing in the company we were celebrating. He raised his eyebrows slightly and said, a family investor. Then I said something like that. Later in the evening, I heard Craig's lead investor, a man named Jeffrey, tell someone that the Harding family had more depth than he'd been led to believe. I didn't say anything to Daniel about that. I didn't need to. There was a moment near the end of the evening, after the speeches and the photographs, when Daniel found me near the window, looking out over the city. He stood beside me for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, Craig was wrong about you. I said, Craig doesn't know me. Daniel said, no. He doesn't. I do. I'm sorry I let that get confused. I looked at my son, 63 years old, and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. And I said, Daniel, I don't need to be the center of everything you do. I never did. I just needed to not be invisible. He nodded. He said, I know. Dad. I didn't understand how far I'd let that go until this week. I said, that's the thing about these lessons. They're only useful if they stick. He asked if I wanted to say a few words to the room. I said no. This was his night. I was there as his father, not as a credential. We drove home separately. He texted me from his car, thank you for not walking away. I replied, that's not what fathers do. 3 weeks later, Daniel called me on a Sunday morning, not with a question about money or a problem to solve. Just to talk. He told me about a setback with a new client, asked my read on how to handle it. I told him what I thought. He didn't agree with all of it, but he listened. That was new. Or rather, it was old again. I've had time to think about what happened and what it means. My son had spent years operating inside a world that told him certain things about success, about image, about what it meant to have arrived. I don't entirely blame him for absorbing those messages. The Craigs of the world are persuasive, but there's a difference between adapting to a new environment and abandoning the people who carried you into it. I am not interested in being a ghost in my son's story. I funded his beginning. I want to be present for what comes next, not as a silent bankroll. As his father, that requires respect from both sides. I know my own work in this. I should have been clearer earlier. Set terms earlier. been a person rather than a resource, long before 11 words on a Thursday morning forced the conversation. But here is what I know, and what I told my son the day we finally sat down properly and talked through all of it over bad coffee at the kitchen table. Support without respect is not generosity. It is a habit that teaches both people the wrong things. The moment you accept being invisible, you become invisible. And the moment you require to be seen, you find out very quickly what the relationship is actually made of. Mine, as it turned out, was made of something worth keeping. It just needed the stress test to prove it. There are no simple lessons in this kind of thing. Anyone who tells you the answer is just to cut your children off and walk away doesn't understand what it costs to do either. The answer is somewhere harder than that. It's in the conversation you should have had 3 years earlier. In the expectation you should have named instead of swallowed. In the moment you looked at the text message and understood, finally, that being generous and being a doormat are not the same thing. My father was right. The moment you let someone treat you like furniture, you've taught them that's all you are. I spent one very difficult week refusing to be furniture. It turned out to be one of the most important things I've done,